Best known as the club where the Beatles got their start, the Cavern Club is perhaps the greatest musical landmark in history. The jazz club was the center of Liverpool's rock and roll scene in the early 1960s, and is responsible for setting some of music's biggest acts on the road to success. Today, we are taking you through the history of this legendary music spot, from its rise to its fall. Located on Matthew Street in Liverpool, the Cavern Club opened in 1957. Owner Alan Sittner's inspiration for the club came from those found in the Jazz District in Paris, which had plenty of clubs in cellars. After returning from a trip to Paris, Sittner went out searching for a venue for his club, with Paris's jazz club Le Caveau de la Huchette as his main source of inspiration. Eventually, he found the spot where the Cavern Club would open, which had previously been a fruit warehouse and, before that, a World War II air raid shelter. The first band to ever perform in the Cavern Club was called the Merseysippy Jazz Band. It was opening night, January 16, 1957, and a reported 600 people were in attendance. While Sittner's original intentions for the club were to have mostly jazz acts perform, the Cavern quickly became a place dominated by skiffle music. The Quarrymen, John Lennon's first band, had their first performance at the Cavern on August 7, 1957. The band got booked to play the Cavern when Nigel Walley, who occasionally played tea-chest bass for the group, asked Sittner's dad to schedule them while the two were playing a round of golf. After hearing the proposition from his father, Sittner agreed to let the Quarrymen play skiffle between two jazz acts. Before going on stage for their first gig at the Cavern, the band members argued about the set list, with Lennon urging the band to play rock and roll songs. However, the rest of the Quarrymen disagreed, as the Cavern didn't allow rock and roll music at the time. But once they were up there and had finished their skiffle song, Lennon told the band to play Elvis Presley's Don't Be Cruel. Rod Davis, the banjo player, told him the audience would hate it, but Lennon started playing the song anyway, leaving the rest of the group no choice but to join in. During the song, Sittner made his way through the crowd and handed Lennon a note that read, "Cut out the bloody rock and roll." Paul McCartney joined the Quarrymen in October of 1957 and played with the group at the Cavern for the first time on January 24, 1958. McCartney explains the early days at the Cavern, saying, "We started getting gigs down at the Cavern. The Cavern was sweaty, damp, dark, loud, and exciting. As usual, we didn't start out with much of an audience, but then people began to hear about us. We could always entertain them. It became our strength later. Whether playing live or making records, we always had something up our sleeve." After much encouragement from McCartney, George Harrison joined the Quarrymen in early 1958. Harrison explains these daytime shows, saying, "We used to play lunchtime dates. We'd get up and go down to the Cavern and play from noon till about 2. It was very casual. We'd have our tea and sandwiches and cigarettes on stage, sing a couple tunes, and tell a few jokes." In 1959, just 2 years after opening, Sittner sold the Cavern to Ray McFall and moved away to London. Under McFall's management, the blues, beat, and rock and roll bands began to flourish at the club. McFall started a tradition called Beat Night, the first being held on May 25, 1960. On this night, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes performed, which Ringo Starr was the drummer for. The first time the Beatles performed under the name The Beatles at the Cavern Club was on February 9, 1961. Ringo Starr was not yet part of the group, but this performance was George Harrison's first time playing at the venue. Eventually becoming regulars at the Cavern, the Beatles started getting increasingly popular, developing a relatively large fan base. Brian Epstein would go on to become the Beatles' manager, sought out the band after someone came into his record store asking for the Beatles. McCartney explains the band's courtship with Epstein, saying, "We did well at the Cavern, attracted some big audiences, and word got around. What had happened was a kid had gone into Brian's record store and asked for My Bonnie by the Beatles. Brian had said, 'No, it's not, it's by Tony Sheridan,' and he ordered it. Then Brian heard that we were playing 200 yards away, so he came to the Cavern and the news got to us. Brian Epstein is in the audience. He might be a manager or a promoter. He is a grown-up anyway. It was us and grown-ups then." Starr made his first appearance with the Beatles at the Cavern on August 19, 1962, and about 1 year later, on August 3, 1963, the Beatles performed their final gig at the venue. The Fab Four made over 290 appearances at the Cavern between the years 1961 and 1963, but with their new record deal, they were onto bigger things. The Beatles' years at the Cavern, however, had a large impact on the world of music. After seeing their success, music producers from London began venturing up to the north of England to see what bands they had to offer. Just a few months after the Beatles made their final appearance at the Cavern Club, another legendary band made their first appearance. The Rolling Stones performed at the venue on November 5th, 1963. Mick Jagger said the following about the gig. "Man, it was hot. We almost sweated away. They've had so many big groups at the Cavern that you've really got to prove yourself. They asked us back, so they must have liked us." 1964 was another successful year at the Cavern in terms of rock and roll legends making appearances. The Yardbirds performed at the club in February of '64, a lineup which included Eric Clapton on lead guitar. The Kinks also made their Cavern debut in '64, covering Little Richard's Long Tall Sally. The Cavern Club had its first closure in February of 1966 after owner Ray McFall declared bankruptcy. However, the club was quickly picked up by two investors, Alf Johagen and Joe Davy. They set out to develop the club and make a number of improvements. A few months later, in July of '66, British Prime Minister Harold Wilson officially reopened the Cavern. Since its closure, the club had added a new entrance, a gift shop, a boutique, a coffee lounge, and an eatery. Ownership switched again in the 1970s, a decade that brought on an onslaught of challenges for the Cavern. Alf sold the club to Harry Waterman and Roy Adams, but the club did continue to pull in acts that would end up becoming stars, including Queen. Queen made their debut at the Cavern on October 31st, 1970. At this Halloween gig, the lineup featured Freddie Mercury, Brian May, Roger Taylor, and Barry Mitchell on bass guitar. John Deacon would join as bass player a year later. New management lasted only a short while. The Cavern Club closed its doors in 1973, with the last major act to perform being Suzi Quatro. The British Rail seized ownership of the warehouse, Block 8 through 12 on Matthew Street, which included the Cavern Club and its cellar. They planned to knock down the building to make room for Liverpool's new underground railway network, but the plan never came to full fruition. A new Cavern Club was opened up right across the street in 1973, but the name changed to the Revolution Club in '76. Once again, however, this club closed down in the same year the name was changed, but resilient as always, the club reopened towards the end of '76 with another name change, Eric's. Eric's would experience its own success in the late '70s, being host to many influential local bands. In 1981, there were plans to excavate the filled-in cellar of the Cavern Club and restore the venue in all its glory. However, due to structural problems, this never happened, but people still held out for restoring the club. In August of 1983, bricks from the original cellar archways were sold for €5 each, and proceeds from 5,000 of the bricks sold went to the Strawberry Fields Children's Home. Thousands of remaining bricks were used to construct the new Cavern Club. The new Cavern Club opened on April 26, 1984. The club was a replica of the original Cavern and its cellar, with an additional bar, restaurant, and memorabilia shop. James McVitie took ownership of the new club in 1987 and brought in live music on Saturday afternoons, as well as disco parties at night. At this point in its history, it comes as little surprise that the club closed again. In December of 1989, the club lost its license, forcing it to close down. But Cavern City Tours took ownership of the club in 1991. They made room for the history of the club to be honored while simultaneously welcoming new bands to come play, one of them being the newly formed Oasis. Various artists who got their start at the Cavern have returned to perform and honor its legacy. In 1999, Paul McCartney returned to the club to say farewell to the 20th century with an iconic performance on December 14th. He also made a surprise appearance in 2018 and performed songs from his career, both old and new. There certainly has been no fall of the Cavern Club, rather ups and downs. Despite its numerous closures and reopenings, the club stands today as a musical landmark, and you can still visit the club and learn all about its history, as well as catch some live music. Responsible for kickstarting the careers of our favorite rock and roll artists, we definitely have the Cavern Club to thank for giving so many bands a platform to share their music. Well, that's all for today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.